All right, welcome to episode 89 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. We have Christopher Mark Rose. He's an author and owner of the blog curiousful. He works at the Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Lab and is a member of the Baltimore Science Fiction Society. He writes mainly about speculative fiction and wrote a story in the book Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories titled God on a Bad Night. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on. And then, so to just kind of get the ball rolling and the conversation started, I guess my first sort of general question would be, what sort of role can science fiction have in philosophy, and how can it be important to that field?
Well, I think both philosophy and science fiction are engines for asking questions and trying to create kind of thought experiments to refine answers. So in that sense, they have a sort of a common mechanism, a common behavior. I feel like the secret underlined theme of the book is that 99% of people get their philosophy from fiction, and particularly from science fiction. So I didn't write the story with that in mind. That the backstory of my appearing in this work is, I'm not sure how much of this I'm supposed to say, but they invited several really accomplished science fiction writers to contribute stories, and one of them dropped out. And so my story and one other story that the editors read, they were really happy with, and so they actually went back to the editor and say, hey, we'd like to include two stories instead of where this one was. And so that really felt great to me. I had not had any idea. I had seen a comment from one of the editors saying, oh, we really need somebody to fill a slot in this book. And I didn't know what to submit. I had several stories in sort of various stages of disrepair, or sort of, in the shop. And a friend of mine said, why don't you send your God story? I'm like, oh, my God story, right? Okay. And I'm so grateful to him. I don't know why, but it would have never occurred to me otherwise. I think because the story sort of ends on what a lot of people perceive as a down note, it wasn't the easiest story to sell. So.
Why did you feel compelled to write that particular story?
So there are two different major components of the story. And I think, one of the things I've had success with in writing was sort of slamming two entirely different things together and seeing what comes out of them. And the first was this excellent book I found called A Big Bang in a Little Room. It's nonfiction, and it's about cosmologists and physicists trying to arrive at a formula or a plan for creating baby universes from our own universe, or at least trying to prove that that's a possibility. And a lot of the specifics of what goes on in the story, and I feel like we should spoil the story so that your listeners
Go for it.
Don't have to wonder. The story is basically told from the perspective of a physicist who's on an artificial satellite in the asteroid belt, and it's called the Big Wheel, and it's basically a gigantic physics experiment, like something like the Large Hadron Collider, but like orders of magnitude bigger. And he's out there, and he had brought his wife and daughter. And subsequent to that, she divorced him and left with the daughter. And so the story opens with a moment where the daughter comes to visit him, and she says, oh, Daddy, my mom and her new boyfriend have ponies. And so I'm not coming to visit you anymore. I'm just going to go live with them because they have ponies. And the story follows through his difficult time trying to I mean, he passes through all the stages, right? First bargaining and some anger and a lot of depression, and finally, where we might wish he came to some peaceful resolution to that. Instead, he basically hijacks the big wheel and performs an experiment without any permission from the higher ups on the satellite, and it appears he creates, a new baby universe. And the descriptions of all that are much in line with what's described in the book.
Right.
I'm not a physicist by trade. I'm an electrical engineer, but I have some interest in those things. And the book was just an incredible find for me. You know how you look down into a remainder bin someday and you think, what is this book doing here? This is just what I was looking for. This book wasn't remainder. Don't get me wrong, but it was just when I found it, I felt like, the moon had fallen on me or something. So that was one aspect of the story, and the other aspect of the story is I really witnessed a conversation between a divorced father apparently and a daughter, very much like this pony moment in the story. I was eavesdropping, and I don't know if other writers do this, but I think either I'm a writer because I'm an inveterate eavesdropper or vice versa. Mm-hmm. But this happened years before I ever started writing. And that one, incident just stuck with me for the whole time. So I felt like, if it was so memorable to me, I should probably work it out in a story, and it might stick with other people too. So, the details of the horses and the rocket trip and all that are sort of, pasted in place to make that event otherwise as to have as much fidelity as possible to the emotion I felt as an innocent bystander listening to that parent-child discussion. And it just my heart turned over when I heard it. I don't know.
Mine too, in a way. I found Arlo, the main character, to be very relatable. When he was speaking with his daughter, and she was telling him about her experiences with her mother and her stepfather, Roger, and kind of how great it is to be with them, explaining this to her father, who misses her, is just happy to see her, but also is not able to connect in the way that he would like to with her, or to be this sort of to give experiences in the same way that Roger and her mother are giving her, and to sort of see that disconnect, and to see like what he really wants to connect with her, but he's just unable to say the things he wants to say, or to relate certain emotions to her. And also because she's so young, it's almost as if like she can't read his I suppose, like it's almost, you would think it's obvious to us, right? Oh, it's so great with these other people. Oh, hi dad, it's good to see you, but I love where I am now. I think I'm going to live with them now instead of with you. And that's generally what she's saying, but she's not reading into the fact that this is so painful for him, and he has to sort of keep a straight face, and just kind of go through the motions. And in this way that really humanized him. And I don't know, I find that's so important for a character, because for instance, like the things that help me to retain memory about a story, it has to be something that sort of gets to me emotionally. And I feel like when I talk about this story, it's very easy to retain everything that I read about it, and sort of be able to explain to somebody what's going on. And I mean, I try to train myself to do things like that anyway, but I felt with your story, it's very easy because the character is so relatable and so humanized.
All right. And, so speaking of the human aspect of him, right, but there was also kind of a sort of dehuman aspect of him. So like there was this part of him, right, that seemed to have been pretty disassociated from just reality on the whole. So even though I guess one can kind of argue that their version of reality seemed to have been kind of like the Matrix, where sort of everything was sort of kind of created and manufactured, right? And as opposed to his reality, which seemed a little more dark and gloomy, right? Mm-hmm. But what's also interesting is that it also kind of seemed to reverse as well, where they were actually living life and they were enjoying it and sort of kind of like tasting the fruits of it, whereas him on the other end was sort of more contemplative. speculative and more sort of stuck in thought. And so I guess I would wonder, Chris, from your kind of perspective, right? If let's say, do we feel like, or do you feel like there's sort of some people who, at the expense of intimacy and at the expense of, let's say if there's a sort of fear of bonding with people, right, and the fear of being loved, accepted, do you feel like sometimes they do, like in sort of Freudian terms, they sublimate and they kind of put all of their energy into sort of more creative tasks, or in this case, like building a universe or trying to, or do they put them into, or do they put their kind of energies into more, what would you call them? A sort of more educational or academic tasks where they kind of get stuck in the world of like thinking, right? In the world of thought. Where for them, it's like on the one hand, you have like the daughter and the mom and even the stepdad who are actually living life in some sense. And then you have this other guy who doesn't really seem like he was ever fully alive.
Wow. Well, I think it's unfair to generalize, a lot of, people doing really sort of thought-centric tasks, or really intellectually engaged, they can I've seen people who sort of span the whole spectrum there. So but I think it's a dangerous it's a dangerous trope to fall into, to assume that everybody who's making progress in some intellectual endeavor is somehow isolated from intimacy, from their familial life. There's a big thing just recently in the news about Einstein's first wife, Mileva Merrick. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear. The record will never be entirely clear. But she was there for this sort of year of light that he had. We produced these 4 like really foundational papers in physics. Like if you look at their interpersonal correspondence, she was right there with them. She was participating, and the original copies of those 4 papers are gone. There's this huge like bibliographic record of his life, 80,000 different pieces of paper that he wrote on, a whole museum in Israel somewhere. But the papers are gone. It's almost like a murder mystery, and we'll never know. So I just feel like that's one of several examples where from the outside you can't tell, but I think a best guess is that the relationship was really helpful for his productivity.
And what do you suppose then went wrong with Arlo? Like, how come sort of his marriage disintegrated? Whereas for him, it was kind of, I think, what I'm describing, where he was kind of so stuck in his work that he didn't really kind of, I guess, focus on or see the needs of his wife and his kid, at least initially.
I'm not sure of the wisdom of his marriage to begin with. It seems like it seems like his wife is interested in different things, maybe, but also it just seems like a pretty a pretty bad choice for him to drag his family out there to this asteroid. That's I went to some lengths to make it feel sort of industrial and inhospitable, especially to kids. And the story is up front that there aren't any other kids there. He has to go out and buy robots to be relatable to kids. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this is not to absolve him from blame for the direction his relationship with his wife took. I mean, he's definitely on the hook to be one half of any relationship he enters into. And it's clear he failed at that. And if you can extrapolate from how he relates to basically losing custody of his daughter, you could see that for a long time he was sublimating his feelings, probably through the relationship with his wife too, like not being expressive, not sharing everything that was on his mind, and all through the story, I'm trying to construct these sort of these body-centered reactions, that his conscious mind isn't part of. It's out of the loop, basically. He's having stomach pains, he's having headaches, he runs into something, he almost tosses his cookies. Like, all of these are signs that he should be reading. And it's only at the very last minute in the story when we actually see him sort of like, the deep emotional pain he's having, like, sort of surface through his consciousness. He actually cries. I worried if that part of the story was a little bit too trite, but I mean, that's the whole arc right there. Is, even from the beginning of the framing of the story, or from way before the beginning of the framing of the story, he's not being honest with himself. He's not letting himself feel the things he should be feeling in his interpersonal relationships.
It was interesting when he went to a friend of his party. I believe it was Sebastian and his wife, and then he ended up meeting a woman there, Marlene. Yeah, and I thought it was interesting how, upon only just meeting her, he related a lot of information about how he was feeling, in terms of like, I was surprised how open he was being with somebody he had only just met, which I thought was strange. And it was also interesting that Marlene was willing to sort of entertain the sort of what would you say, like the diatribe that he was sort of going through. But yeah, he was being a completely vulnerable. First, she's asking, like, are you married? Right? He's like, no, tosses his ring into the fruit punch, which I thought was interesting. And I thought it was going to go somewhere with her. And then he starts saying that he's not with his daughter. He starts to sort of, there's this sort of this sort of dark, or maybe like a sort of a depressed undertone in his explanation to her of what he's currently feeling and going through. Sure. But it was interesting that, so he couldn't take fully letting out his feelings, so he had to sort of get out of the situation and get away from there. But I thought that was interesting, that it looked like almost like as if he was starting to crack in a way, as if he almost had some sort of a breakthrough, but wasn't quite there. But he was nearing, like, being able to connect to someone again. So yeah, that's an interesting sort of dynamic at play.
And then he ran away.
He ran away.
Yeah. He ran away, exactly.
He ran as far as he could, right? Any sort of level of intimacy that sort of I guess protrudes into his life, he's out.
But it's interesting that he went as far as he did, because you would think it's not a social norm with somebody you only just met to say, give as much information as he was about his life. Right. So it almost felt as if, like, he was on the precipice of something, but couldn't quite get there. And then because of the rebound of not getting there, he became more entrenched sort of in his depression, took to the peach schnapps, right? And sort of...
So, Chris, by any chance, did this story remind you of a sort of Faustian bargain? Where, like, instead of sort of love and intimacy and kind of life as, most people would think of it, he was kind of granted, let's say, the sort of secrets of the universe, right? And in this case, in creating a new universe.
Oh, well, I hadn't thought of it that way, but it certainly scans. I wrote the story, and it sat around for a long time, and then it occurred to me that there's this sort of parallel between, the father not really understanding their child, or being able to express, or to have communication, and then the creator sort of being isolated from their creation. And there's this actual mechanism, this Hawking radiation, that I honestly, I don't understand the physics of it, but it seems very clear from what I've read everywhere that once you create one of these baby universes, it's basically gone from your ability to communicate with it or sense it in any straightforward way. There is a little mention in the Big Bang book about scientists trying to look for messages in the cosmic background radiation, which might be one way to divine whether our universe is sort of natural, like, or the product of some other intelligence. So there are actually people doing this. I don't know what the likely.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on simulation theory?
Well, boy, I see that in two different directions. Like, on the one hand, sort of the whole idea about the matrix and, our existence, our universe being somehow a giant simulation. That's also broached in the book. I'm telling you, that book is just a wellspring They talk about looking for something like a glitch or an upgrade, like all the different mechanisms that you think of with your home computer. They use as analogies for some kind of an indication that we might be in some kind of a simulation. My thoughts are that it doesn't really matter. That whether we're in a simulation or not, probably in our lifetime, we won't have evidence that's unassailable. So I think it's fun to imagine. I think a bigger ethical question is, should we create our own simulations?
Right.
And what responsibility do we bear to them if they produce intelligence?
Yeah.
Right. I noticed that in the notes after your story, there's a bit in there about having listened to a lecture by some physicists, right? And how they discussed the possibilities of what could be done by creating another universe and sort of the theoretical implication. No, well, actually, sorry. What I want to say is they didn't get into the philosophical implications of what it would be to actually create another universe, right? And that was, as I understood it, perplexing to you why scientists weren't getting into the ethics of if you did have the power to create another universe, what sort of what would you do it? What sort of responsibility would you bear? And then I think your story is important because, I mean, the person who ended up creating another universe, they didn't have any of that in mind. They were just having a bad night, right? Hence God on a bad night, right? And I thought that was very fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Big Bang book, there's a lot of circling back to this issue that all of the physicists and cosmologists that she's interviewing seem sort of gleefully like separated from the moral or the ethical implications of what they're doing. And that I couldn't parse that for a long time. Finally, I think what I understand is that a lot of them are believers in this sort of many worlds interpretation of quantum theory. So in that, like, every time you make a decision, you're really creating two separate, like, coexistent parallel universes. I feel like there's a lot of holes in that theory, and I don't understand what good it does in terms of what it makes easier in terms of the rest of cosmology or physics. But it seems to give them like a blanket absolution from considering the ethical issues.
Oh, and by the way, just FYI, have you heard of the double slit experiment?
Yes,
Yeah.
I have.
So that's actually it. So my understanding of it, obviously I'm not a physicist, so please, don't take anything that I say too seriously. So, but from my understanding of from the double slit experiment is essentially initially the first interpretation, the Copenhagen interpretation, was that it was the measuring device that was causing, so do you remember it?
Right. A particle can be either, a wave could it could be either a wave
or a particle, right? Depending on if it's being measured, right? So the Copenhagen interpretation was essentially that it was being measured, and the measuring device was the one that was actually affecting it, and then eventually turned into somewhere down the line the observer effect with I think his name was Eugene Wigner. So there were plenty of like materialist physicists who hated that interpretation, and they said, no, that doesn't make any sense. The observer is not affecting any of that. So they came up with the multiverse interpretation. It's also based on theoretical physics, which I will never understand. But the point is that it was their answer to the kind of measurement problem. So that was it. Their understanding was it's not actually the measurement device that's causing it to happen. It's actually just it's pretty much random. It's a product of random luck, where the idea is, well, in one universe, it's a particle, in the other universe, it's a wave. And that's just how it is, right? It doesn't actually matter what the observer is doing. It's just called kind of like a hodgepodge of randomness.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can subscribe to that. I feel like that's absolves you from any more investigation of what's a primary effect. Like, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of different like variations on that experiment. It's primal. So I feel like it's the reason that it is because there are these different interpretations that people can sort of disagree about. If it were straightforward, we'd be done with it by now.
Right. Yeah.
So
oh, yeah. Right. Now I just remembered. So no, I was actually a little bit wrong off on my my understanding. So it was that like every single time that there is no measuring device and all of the particles are spread out and kind of on the backboard. So the idea there was that it's actually not a wave, that they're actually all particles, and all of the particles are actualized in a different universe. So it's not that it's a wave of probability. In reality, it's something along the lines of like it gets actualized in different universes.
Right. And as far as interpretations go, I remember one of the first interpretations was, oh well, if you need the presence of the presence of an observer changes whether it's a particle or a wave or the quality. A lot of people misinterpreted that to say that they used it in sort of as a way to explain sort of new agey sort of ideas. They would say
the consciousness effect.
Like how, like sort of that law of attraction thing, like The Secret,
right?
Which there may be. So as far as manifesting something with a thought and a frequency matching another frequency and all of that, and using that experiment as a way to sort of support that, I don't agree with. Sure, it could be possible, so I'll keep an open mind. Fair enough, but probably not. The only application maybe of the law of attraction that sort of may be practical is, I suppose, if you're looking through a filter of a positive thought, you'll look for positive, like proof of things that will support that thought. And then that may then alter, what path you may be on and affect it in that sense.
Right.
And that's the slight sort of effect you could sort of have on your reality, so to speak. That's about it as far as that goes. But sorry,
it's okay. So, and Chris, I guess for you, right, what would you say is like the main issue or your main issue with the many worlds interpretation?
So I can't speak to the physics of it at all, but I feel like it's a crutch from addressing the moral and ethical implications of whatever you're doing. It's a justification for doing whatever you wanted to do anyway. And I think, this question about creating intelligence is, it is the 100th anniversary of the creation or the naming of a robot, by the way, this year. So it's been a long time coming. We've had this idea sort of in our collective subconscious. It's in our popular culture, it's in our literature for a long, long time. And I feel like, morally and ethically, we're totally unprepared for when we create artificial intelligences, how we're going to relate to them, how we're going to see our obligations and responsibilities to them. It's coming faster than we think. You can see the military-industrial complex just in a lather, waiting to have fully autonomous weapons. We have an obligation, and particularly philosophers, ethicists, of addressing this head on, and not just letting it be some game in academic circles, but to popularize a real, hard as nails discussion about what our obligations are. So.
Yeah, I think it's Ray Kurzweil who thinks that in 2048 we'll have a technological singularity, and at that point we'll have created a generally intelligent AI. Some people think sooner, some people think later, but you're right. Yeah, it may not be as far away as we think. And yeah, how would we deal with it? And also, if we do end up with that generally intelligent AI, will it be a benevolent one? Will it be one that maybe sees us as a blight or a parasite or something like that on the planet, depending on how it optimizes for what's the net good or the net bad that humans sort of provide, I would say. Sure. Maybe it doesn't think in those terms. Like whatever I just expressed is so limited that it takes in millions of other variables and then aggregates those variables, and then the emergent is something that I cannot even fathom 1/10 of. don't know, but its processing power and speed will be insane when and if we do have like a legitimate, generally intelligent AI.
But by the way, and just going back to the story, right? So if Arlo can get kind of sucked into, I don't know, the world of, let's say, kind of hypothetical and theoretical physics and potentially creating new universes and whatnot, and sort of, disassociate from his family, what's going to happen when we have AIs all over the place? Do you even think that people will have the same level of friendships and relationships that they did before?
You never know. I wonder because if we do actually get to that point when we do, when you're saying AI, on what level? Like, do you mean like your phone will?
Oh, good question. Like robots. I mean, like robots.
And just be able to have a conversation with you?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, question. It's programmed to have certain programmed responses to you and read you a certain way. And
what if it's programmed in a way to make a decision, right? So it's like it could choose from particular responses.
If it's going to be that idea of a generally intelligent AI,
mm-hmm.
then I think once it exists, it'll optimize for a whole bunch of experience for animals, humans, and for technology, and also the rate at which it will produce more inventions and probably Nobel Prize winning discovery, or what we would deem Nobel Prize winning discoveries. Everything would start coming out way, 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 way faster.
Right.
So I think it would, if it's a benevolent version of this, it would optimize for our experience and see every single thing that we see as an issue currently in discourse.
Right.
So maybe we would have good interactions.
Yeah. Hopefully not at the expense of like real interactions.
So Christopher, I was joking about this I think yesterday with my friends, if we did actually have a generally intelligent AI. So I have my phone here. Mm-hmm. I wonder if let's say we were having a podcast and it hears us discussing whatever we're discussing, if it would start to chime in like how a person would chime in.
Uh-huh.
And that would be interesting too, mm-hmm. if it just became another participant in conversation. Yeah. Maybe also it would fact check you. Like,
that would actually be
pretty
funny.
Or whatever,
that wouldn't be a bad thing. I don't think that would be really useful.
That'd be great.
Yeah. I think in general, my expectation is when general AI comes out, first of all, we might not even realize it for a long time. Mm-hmm. And second of all, we will probably be the least of its interest. Just like we're busy making robots and making AI now, it's going to make something else down the line, and our fingerprints won't be on that. That'll be an entirely different thing altogether. So it's easy for me to imagine the whole process sort of running away from us if we're not careful. So I have a story out in this month's Asimov's. Mm-hmm. Asimov's is this kind of a pulpy science fiction magazine. I say that in the best possible way. And it's about a robot that comes upon some amount of general intelligence and some amount of sympathy or empathy for humans on its own. And sort of in parallel with that story, there's a set of author's notes that are going to go up on the Asimov website any day now. And this is my essay that talks about the literary record we're leaving behind us. All of the fiction we've written about robots, robots are going to read that at some point. Mm-hmm. AI is going to read that. I really don't think it shows us in the best light, and particularly Asimov. The sort of the premise of the story is that Asimov himself was kind of a bigot regarding human life and artificial life. I was surprised they published it, but I'm glad.
Yeah. And so going back to kind of the initial story, right? What do you feel like, why was Arlo so obsessed with creating a new universe? Why was that so important to him?
I think that's a good question. I'm not sure I completely answered it before I started writing, but it's easy to imagine. It's easy to imagine it being some kind of surrogate for confirming that the work he's doing is worthwhile in general. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's no bad guy character in the background that's his rival in terms of physics. I had considered and then crossed out such a thing. It's not. it's not a sort of a good versus evil relationship. I remember when I was writing his character, I was really trying to make a character who was nuanced. I feel like, I mean, you can plow through a lot of science fiction and find characters that are very much like hashtag innocent, hashtag villain, hashtag, retribution. I really want to create characters that are, that have gray areas, that are believable, relatable. So another backstory of this story is I had been watching a documentary with my sister quite a long time ago now. It was a documentary about the life of I'm gonna blow the name now. Frank Lloyd Wright. And it shows him doing his thing, making great architecture, changing our perception of what our living spaces should be. And then halfway through it, surprise, he leaves his wife and his 6 children and runs off with the nanny. They go to New Mexico or Arizona and build Taliesin West. And then my sister saw that and she said, he is going to burn in hell. And I'm like, how can you say that? Like, he changed everything in American architecture. He changed our perception of beauty and how we spend our time and all these things. Doesn't that count for something? And we never came to an agreement upon that. But I think Arlo has this same sort of micro macro thing going on. Like in the foreground at a micro scale, he's not being successful at being a good dad or being a good husband, or who knows, even his relationship with his coworkers. But on a macro scale, he might have created something with, who knows, billions, trillions of living creatures, maybe intelligence, who knows, what will exist further on, these sort of putative life forms in the new universe. I kind of like put my thumb on the scale a little bit relative to Frank Lloyd Wright, because I had some sympathy for Arlo myself. But there's really there's no way to calculate if there is such a thing as a sort of an unbiased calculation of the value of somebody's life. There's no way to calculate how those kinds of creative acts relate to life around you, on the ground, in the house.
Right. And he was a sympathetic character, because I remember there was a point in the book where essentially I think he said something along the lines of either was I think it was a thought where he thought it was like a part of the backstory where the reason why he wasn't coming home was essentially because he was kind of tired of disappointing his wife. So there's a bit of selflessness there. It wasn't that, well, I'm just hanging out and I'm kind of working on my physics and creating a universe and I don't care about this person. It really just seemed like he was running away. He was running away from sadness, from her end, from his end. He seemed like more than anything he cared about her, but he just didn't know how to deal with it.
But I mean, those are his perceptions too, I think. Yeah. I have been surprised at how different readers have reacted to Arlo. A lot of people don't think he's such a sympathetic character, in spite of all the stuff that I put in there that I felt like could make him more understandable. Right. I mean, really on ground level, he's kind of a cipher. Like, he's obsessed with this gigantic collider thing, and he's got data pouring into his house, and it's accumulating in all these like these 3D displays in the middle of his living room. I think if we were confronted with him, I don't know what we'd make of him.
From other readers' reactions to Arlo, how did they feel about him? I mean, I guess maybe we like to try to understand the character, right? And also that might be part of our own bias, actually, right? To try to understand them, see what their motivations are for what they're doing. Not everyone it's not all black and white. Not everyone's good or bad. Sure, that's our take. But yeah, what do other readers sort of feel about him?
Well, I feel like I can't really. It would be wrong for me to misrepresent things, but I mean, my perception is that the most relatable character in the story is the daughter. I mean, she wants what she wants, but of course she's a daughter. She's 6 years old, and I really had to tinker a lot. Like, a lot of people came back to me and said, what she's saying here is too adult for somebody that age, or these two behaviors don't sound like the same age of care of kid. And I think, once you're a parent and you've lived through the whole spectrum of it, sometimes it can all get compressed in your own mind. Like, oh, I see pictures of my daughter now when she was 3 or 4, and it's hard for me to remember that she's not the same character, But yeah, in general. So here's the fact that I've come to grips with recently. The majority of readers of fiction and buyers of fiction are female now, and have been for some time, and it's a big number. So I think you have to factor that in a little bit. Everybody has a sort of an ideal reader, right? Like, I'm reading this story and I'm imagining how so-and-so will react to it.
Yeah, and it also, go ahead.
But I think, at least for science fiction writers and readers, the scientist in the story is obviously the character you're going to empathize with. Like, oh, I really hope they're successful at doing the science thing. That didn't happen here. Maybe that's not the standard anymore.
Yeah, and I also think, just in my opinion, obviously, I mean, I can't know for sure, but in my opinion, I think a lot of, if you do find it hard to kind of empathize with Arlo, I think it's a little bit more personal there. And I can imagine how maybe, let's say, somebody who's reading the story and maybe their husband is a little bit more avoidant, and they're thinking like, oh, like, I've been in this position before.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been in this position before, and it's like, it makes me feel like shit. But the thing is, it's like, so I try to view things from more of a clinical lens, and from the lens, especially in this case, of attachment styles. So it does seem like he has what's called an avoidant attachment style, where he finds it difficult to relate to people, in particular people he loves and who obviously love him back. So I mean, it's definitely understandable, obviously, how his daughter and wife would be hurt by his behavior. But that little snippet in the book where he talks about how it's so difficult for him to kind of come home and feel like he's disappointing her, it actually reminds me of this movie. Have you guys ever seen the Clint Eastwood movie, The Mule?
No, that's new, right?
New-ish. I would say maybe 2 years ago. So that's exactly actually what happened in the story. So he was obsessed. So he was like a gardener, but he was like a sort of nationally wide kind of like famous gardener. Like, the way he would create like just these bouquets of flowers was just extraordinary. And then so his wife in the film ends up pretty much, I think she gets cancer and she finally ends up dying. And they have this moment where she's like, I don't understand like why you did this to us. She's like, you literally abandoned your family. And she's like, I could never forgive you for that. And then so he tells her, he's like, I wish you only understood and knew how hard it was for me to come home to disappoint you every single time. So for him, with the avoidant attachment style, he was just running away from her. So look, obviously we understand from the wife's perspective as a husband. I mean, you kind of have some responsibility, obviously, and you owe it to your family to be there. However, also from a clinical perspective, and when we're talking about attachment styles, it's not that easy to overcome. And so even if he were wrong, and by the way, that's what happened in the film. Like, she's like, what are you talking about? She's like, we all loved you. You never disappointed any of us. But if in his mind, the belief is like, well, you know what? I'm coming home and I'm constantly upsetting people. I'm constantly making them sad. I don't want to do that. I don't want to, feel bad, and I don't want to make other people feel bad. But what's interesting is that in that sort of in that world of gardening, or kind of setting up flowers, I don't even know what you would call it, he's like, yeah, he's like, I felt like I was competent. He's like, I always got the recognition and sort of the rewards I was looking for, and here was this thing that I was really good at, and I got the kind of the sort of feedback that I was looking for. Whereas where I would come home, he's like, it was sort of, I felt kind of dead. I don't know if he said that, but it's something along those lines. He said that I just didn't feel like I was kind of living up to my responsibility. So one can definitely argue, look, as a sort of father and as a husband, you owe it to your family to kind of look into that and to, get better or change or work with your family on that. Sure. But then also on the other hand, if he was genuinely or generally terrified and then really felt hopeless about changing a situation, just like it seemed like what happened with Arlo, you can easily understand why somebody would want to run away from that. Yeah.
So, but I think the sort of confrontation with Marlene at the end of the story is his chance to sort of redeem himself. Mm-hmm. And he gets right to the edge of it, and then he muffs it and runs away. I feel like if the jury was out before then, it's clear after that. He's a flawed character. He's by design a flawed character.
Yeah. And then it seems like what he does more so than anything, when things get hard, he runs away. There's a sense of hopelessness there that it's like, I can't make this work, even if I try.
And then buries himself in his work, obviously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And then, so philosophically speaking, right, what would you say are some of the sort of themes or the ideas that you would want your readers to take away?
Well, I think, this thread that we've been pulling on about what's your relationship with, or what your responsibilities are to things you've created, whether they be your own children or an entire new universe, is a big, open, unanswered question that we need to work harder at. And maybe this is just my outlook as a parent, but I mean, it's sort of baked into the story.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Responsibility as a theme, right? It's important to realize that you don't, well, I may have to re-edit this as I say this, but it's fine. I think it's important to be vigilant, right? Especially when you're in the process of creation, especially when making something like of the nature of a hadron collider, something that could create these mini universes that could spawn life, that you're responsible for creating both. You have created life, but you've also created a whole pain and suffering potentially, right? And you're responsible for all these new lives and all of that. And it's important not to do what he did, right? Which is, you get drunk on peach schnapps, you're having a horrible night, and
pull the trigger.
Pull the trigger and just create this new universe, right? Arguably it's the same thing when creating anything. It's almost as if it's kind of like being in a way half-assed about it, right?
Yeah.
And then and it's important because what you put out there, once it's out there for the world to sort of play with, or to judge, or to criticize, or to work with. And especially if you're, let's say, an author, or I don't know, or doing what we're doing right now, like a podcast, let's say, just hypothetically, I was incredibly depressed, very low energy, low tone, or something like that. I wasn't giving it 100%, or Leon, same thing. And then you kind of present that to an audience, and they're kind of like, what am I listening to?
Mm-hmm.
And let's say you have this overarching goal, or you did, where you want to impact people in a sort of positive way or something like that, but you're not giving it your all, you're not being vigilant. Then the consequence of not trying to give your best every single time, it'll hurt that overarching goal, which I'm sure Arlo had at one point and was very congruent with. Like, I'm sure there was one point in his, I understand it's a fictional character, but there's one point in his life where this was something near and dear to his heart, something that he was very passionate about. Otherwise, he wouldn't have put up the years of study that he did, and wouldn't have gone to the lengths that he did to learn what he learned.
Right.
So to lose sight of yourself, it's important not to.
Yeah. And I would also add to that going back to the responsibility factor, it's like, so again, going back to attachment styles, you kind of understand that obviously a person can be avoidant and afraid, obviously, just afraid of making decisions. So the problem with Arlo was that he was very childlike in his decision making. So it's not that he said, well, you know what, I'm afraid of taking care of this child, or I'm afraid of bonding with them. I'm afraid of maybe taking care of this universe and taking responsibility for it. Maybe I should stay away from it. He just said, no, I'm going to still make these things happen without the foresight necessary, obviously. And then when it came time to take responsibility for it, he's like, ooh, no, I don't really want that much to do with it. So I think if anything, that's probably what his wife was most upset about. It was probably like, dude, like, you married me, you made this decision, so it's up to you now to figure out a way to make it work. Like, maybe there's some part of her that understood, like, yes, I get it. You have like these really, sort of toxic beliefs, and you may not feel like you're up to the task, but then why'd you do it? Why'd you get married? Why did we start a family? And in this other respect, why did you create a universe if you're not willing to take responsibility for it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Yeah, and I think kind of people tend to struggle with that. And just by the way, from again going back to the clinical perspective, you see clients a lot like that who just it's like they're kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So it's like they want to put themselves out there, which is obviously great. But then when they do, they don't want to take full responsibility for those choices. Like going into a relationship, it's like you're like, well, I want a boyfriend or whatever, and then you're like, okay, this person is my boyfriend, and then things get kind of tough, and you start avoiding, and then the other person's like, I don't understand. You seem to have wanted to have dated me. Now you don't. So it kind of seems like Arlo was stuck in this childlike state where on the one hand, he wants to be alive and he wants to make these big decisions, but on the other hand, he just doesn't want to be responsible for them.
He's sort of maybe an everyman in that regard. Like, I feel like nothing would happen if we waited to be entirely informed of all the possibilities and responsibilities. I mean, sometimes I think it's essential that you have to sort of take that creative leap, but at the same time, you have to sort of back it up. So,
yeah. What do you think would have happened had the story continued? Like, let's say if the universe were created, and then what do you think he would have done?
Interesting.
Well, I mean, I would be dishonest if I didn't tell you that I was imagining follow-on stories. There's a moment towards the end after Arlo runs away, where sort of Marlene lingers in the shot, kind of. And she performs this little defiant pirouette just by herself in the hallway. She's really the character for the book that the story might eventually become. Because I'm sure that Arlo is culpable for taking the whole like Hadron Collider thing for a giant joyride. And I'm sure he may do time for that, or at least they're going to send him away. But this sort of notion of a multiverse that can be modeled with like bubble-like behavior really appealed to me. I have kids, we've used soap bubbles before. I see all these different behaviors. I'm getting to a sort of a sequel story where, two bubbles are in contact and the wall between them just goes away. That's sort of the notion I was looking for. Like, if you can take this, because the book has even pictures of this sort of like this teardrop effect and the wormhole between the nascent daughter universe and the I'm not remembering all the words. The pure vacuum of the parent universe, and so it describes these things, and it actually has diagrams of them, and it's quite an elaborate analogy, and I just wanted to see how far we could push that. Like, what if the wall between this universe and some other universe have, just disappeared one day? What would be the result? So that's the bigger thing I'm aiming for eventually.
Yeah.
Sorry. So before I actually finished reading the last page of the story, this is interesting. So I finally understood what had happened, but I kind of did a double take. When sometimes you didn't fully understand what happened at the end. Okay. So initially, what I thought happened was he ended up destroying his own universe and creating another universe, right? And letting it, pulling the trigger in that sense. I'm glad that he didn't, of course, right? But I was wondering, what would have happened if he did something like that? Like, he wanted a new, like, I thought he had an impulse that he wanted to have some sort of a new life, or that the life that he was leading and living was not worth living anymore. That's how I took that at first. It would have been interesting if that happened, but it's I'm happy that it didn't, and there's sort of more of a consequence. He's like, oh no, what have I just done? Yeah. And sorry, what were we gonna say?
Wow, I don't know if I remember. Wait, there was a question about Arlo and the creation of the. Oh yeah. So why do you think that he didn't really take the considerations of the ethics committee as seriously as he should
have? I just don't think he has this. Well, on the one hand, he doesn't have the spare cycles to do that. He's so involved in the technical side of it. But on the other hand, he may in fact be a practitioner of this many worlds hypothesis. I I might have leaned into that more, if I'd had the story to edit it another time, just sort of make clear his ethical disregard for the whole thing that he's doing.
Right.
But on the other hand, he knows a priori that, he's only going to get one glimpse as it happens, and then it's going to be gone. Like, he's never going to know if intelligent life happens there. He's only going to know, what the shape of the cosmic background radiation is, maybe what the fine structure constant is, like, these half a dozen different physics variables that really determine the shape of our universe and how it evolves. That's all he gets, like one little glimpse of, and that's it. So it makes it easier for him to disregard, the consequences of what he's doing.
Right.
There are only consequences there. Nobody from here can ever get there, and nothing from there can ever get here. So it's almost imaginary to him.
And that would make sense why he's not such a sympathetic character then. Because like on the one hand, obviously you can empathize and say, well, it seems like he's kind of down on himself, or he doesn't really have much in terms of confidence. But then on top of that, he's also pretty irresponsible, and he does things that, I mean, look, there are times obviously when you can go against the majority and you can be right, obviously, even though it doesn't happen often. But the point is that here, I mean, if an ethics committee is telling you like, hey man, like this is probably not a good idea, let's at least think about this and wait a little longer, and you completely disregard that. I mean, that's pretty childlike, and that's sort of an issue with that person. I mean, look, whether or not he should be punished, I don't know. Probably yes. To what extent? Another thing I don't necessarily know. But it is interesting that people sometimes think, well, you know what? It's like, I think I'm right, or I know I'm right, and they just make these decisions without actually kind of thinking about where they can go.
Right. So right, if you're, let's say you're getting feedback, right, especially from an ethics committee, they're actually like an authority that you should be trusting for feedback. Right. You could be right, sure. I'm sure there's times where people have been right in those kinds of situations, but yeah, I understand if it was other people giving feedback, right? If it's a Twitter, let's say, right? You have Twitter trolls, or sometimes somebody who's just not very well versed in whatever topic it is that you're talking about, and they give you feedback. Yeah, in that sense, there's times when you can sort of disregard the feedback and you stay on your path, you do what you do. But yeah, there's other times where it's very important to take on feedback and listen to what experts in your field have to tell you.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And it's like when you're thinking about even feedback and we're thinking about like risks and consequences, right? It's not the same thing as sort of creating something and thinking, well, okay, this is going to fail, or it's going to hurt me because, I don't know, maybe ruin my reputation or something along those lines. Like this has exponential consequences for, in this case, if it's a universe, we're talking about potentially billions of people or whatever, aliens or whatever, kind of you want to call these figures. So I guess, Chris, in one of our sort of final questions, right? Do you feel like in terms of responsibility, or actually, let me rephrase this question. What do you feel like in terms of responsibility and in terms of kind of what Arlo did? What do you want the big takeaway to be for your audience?
Boy, can I answer that twice?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I mean, on the one hand, I'm going to stand on a soapbox and say, there exists this big ethics committee, on the big wheel, and there exists all of these mechanisms to prevent people from just taking it from a joyride. You see him sort of defeat the security and turn off all of the monitors and everything. Like, I think doing those things isn't enough. The people who actually have their hands on the controls, the scientists and the engineers, they need to be part of the discussion about ethics. That's, that was true in 1942, and it's true today. Like, as a career engineer, I really feel like there's not enough of those discussions or that education that happens in my career field. I mean, you can go back and see, after the first atomic bomb was burst, there were people that came forward like Johnny von Neumann, who wrote to Congress, who wrote to the president, who, some of the people involved in the Manhattan Project and completely turned around their outlook and became crusaders for nuclear disarmament and for peace. after that incident, so there are lots of tangible examples right now of how ethics doesn't just apply to shouldn't be done by a separate group. It needs to be sort of baked into the different career paths, scientists and engineers. I'm really like, my wife is in the medical profession, and when they get their degree, they stand up and they take an oath. Like, right. Why is there no such oath like that for engineering or for science?
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What was the second part?
The second part is that I feel like it's not healthy for anybody to be so ensconced in their intellectual pursuits that they starve their interpersonal relationships. And especially like right now, after everybody has been isolated by the pandemic for a year, it's been a year since I've sat down at a lunch table and talked to my coworkers. It's been a year since I've gone and hugged my family in upstate New York. We really have, personal, intimate, firsthand experience of how important it is to not be isolated from the basic ground level relationships that give us humanity and help us put these other ethical questions in a proper framework.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Alan, final questions for Chris before we go?
All right. Chris, if we wanted to follow your work, where could we find you?
Oh, so yeah. So there's a lot of things. There's a blog called curiousful.wordpress.com. Infrequent, but a lot of discussion there about the process of my writing, what's going on with that, bigger questions about responsibilities for writers, things like that. I'm on Twitter at @CChrisRose. That's similar. Also, I'm a member of the Science Fiction Writers of America. You can find me there. I am a member of Charm City Spec, which is a set of reading events, basically, quarterly in Baltimore. We invite people who write speculative fiction to approach us and maybe come to an event and read, plug their work and explain what it's about. We have had a year-long hiatus, and it's really eating me because I feel like there's a lot of good fellowship there. It's a good place to connect to the local writing community. And also, I'm a member of the Baltimore Science Fiction Society. I show up at their critique circle most of the time now. And that's a good place to sort of get your feet wet if you want to be a writer. So I'm in all those places.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Absolutely, man. We'll be in touch with you soon.
Thanks. Take care.
Bye, Chris.
Bye.
All right. That was awesome.
That was really fun.
So guys, if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe,
hit the bell on YouTube.
Yep. And yeah, thank you so much for watching. I look forward to the next episode. See you next time.